Suddenly we started hearing people saying, music can be composed by machines, ChatGPT can write articles instead of journalists, and that's creativity. It's all out there. There's nothing that a human is going to really compete with in the next few years. What's your response to that?
I think true. So I would actually say, and you might think this sounds like total exaggeration, but we might be in a once-in-a-species event in terms of creativity. And let me put it to you in terms like this. For most of the span of human existence, creativity has been incredibly costly. You know, just in order to spend the time doing the cave painting or doing a painting or writing a text, that time was very, very valuable. You know, that could have been time you were in a field or fighting a war or something like that. The materials, things like paper and paint and ink and so on, really expensive, really difficult. And what we've actually seen probably over the last 500 years is slowly the costs of creativity went down and we got more machines and a more productive economy, a greater world population, more education. So, you know, creativity became cheaper slowly and then with increasing speed. And I think that the key moment really was once you had billions of people plugged into the internet with very cheap digital tools, suddenly that was a sort of inflection point, and creativity was everywhere and it was opened up. The taps were opened. Whatever creative endeavor you were doing, suddenly it was supercharged. And that was a huge moment. And now we've got a moment where creativity is just becoming free and infinite because the capability of machines, large language models, transformer models is becoming so extraordinary at an exponential pace, in fact, an even faster than exponential pace, that almost any output of any kind will probably in the next 5 years be able to be generated instantaneously by AI. So to me, it is a once-in-a-species event of creativity becoming free and infinite. And that's both exciting and also quite crazy.
Okay, Tony, do you agree with Michael's analysis of where we are at this point in history when it comes to creativity?
You know, I believe creativity is fundamentally a human enterprise. I run the biggest library, or the most used library on the planet. We're a little old-fashioned in that regard. You know, I think creativity depends upon access to the largest possible population of the highest quality information. Mm-hmm. We think that has already been achieved, but it has not. In New York City, there are 2 million citizens in New York City who don't have broadband at home.
Wow.
Right? I mean, so let's just start with the sort of getting into the system. And everyone assumes that if you do have that connectivity, you have access to the world's quality information, the corpus of accumulated human knowledge across civilizations. That is simply not true. There is a lot online, but you cannot read, as an individual, most of the books. They're behind paywalls or copyright restrictions. Right. So we have people excluded, and we have quality information excluded. And I believe if we don't solve those problems, we won't have the creativity we need from humans interacting with, curating artificial intelligence and other forms of machine learning.
So, Tony, you're raising the point of access and the realities on the ground of who can actually get to this information that exists and creativity and what they can get, right? And then there's the quality element. So even if you can get it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's of the best quality. But I want to go back to what you said, that creativity is a human endeavor, because I think that in itself takes some reflection. So, Michael, what do you think? Is creativity not a human endeavor? And after all, anything that's being curated by the machines is based on what humans have themselves done.
I would say that creativity probably is a human endeavor, in as much as, you know, when an AI model spits out its output, it is just kind of processing a vast amount of data in an interesting way. But here's the key point. I think we have to change our way of understanding human creativity in a response, because the dominant model we have of creativity has to change. You know, the idea of a creative genius sitting alone somewhere and having some kind of bright spark and that changing the world, that's probably not appropriate anymore. At this point in history, there's so much accumulated stuff that most of those kind of obvious avenues are already done. You know, actually, just because the machines themselves are not creative, that doesn't mean they're not useful. So for me now, human creativity is something that is augmented by machines, and trying to pretend it's not is putting the genie back in the bottle, and it's not going to happen.
I agree with that.
So
I don't think we should ignore what's happening online, and it is a complete fundamental change. It has costs, going back to the earlier conversation. I mean, I think basically the large companies, monopolies that are driving much of the technology here, you know, we've given up privacy to them for profit reasons. I think it's just straight up. Personally, I believe that our private data, what I read, what I think, belongs to me, not to a company that provides it to me. And I think that's a sea change that could have remarkable consequences. But, you know, I want to go back to the Benedict Anderson that you started with. You know, Ben Anderson's argument is simultaneous reading of newspapers created the idea of a nation, of a community that you didn't know all the members of was too big. We're now moving to a global community. And the technology is usually important in that. But again, to what purpose? Going back to where we were. If the purpose is just to entertain in a sort of opiate sort of way, that is not going to solve the problems we're facing. Look, we're all gathered here because we face global problems. We need a global community to address those problems. We need all hands on deck, everyone's talent and intellect engaged in that. I'm not sure that's where the technology is leading us at this point. And already we see individuals, lots of people being left out, digital divide, and lots of quality information being left out that is curtailing our ability to solve these problems and to talk to each other.
So, based on what Tony's saying, Michael, I want to bring you in to think about this idea of how children are learning. So, at school, we all learned painting. Some of us were crap at it, like myself, not so great. And some were great, and then went on to become painters and artists. But we were given that outlet as we were growing up. Do you think that learning how to be creative for this generation of children and the coming generation of children will change? And then how does that change how they think, how their minds are formed?
Possibly. So, I mean, I would just sum up this whole thing for children, for governments, education systems, as a shift from sort of raw creativity to curation. And, everything can really be encapsulated just in that shift. And it's why I think institutions like, great institutions like the New York Public Library are probably going to be more important in the next 100 years than at any other time. Because when the cost of creativity is essentially free, you live just surrounded in an atmosphere of it. And, to be honest, what matters, what's important, what's significant, what in this just tidal wave of creativity is worth keeping, preserving, and sharing with the world, that becomes the core skill. So I think teaching people about curation, teaching people about filtering through this whole morass, is going to be the key thing. And I think, of course we want children to learn about how to paint and of course how to write, but we also need to teach them more about expertise, about judgment, about understanding how to parse and sift a world of infinite information and creativity. So I really think that's important. And then there's just a second point which slightly shifts the discussion. I think every education conference that you go to, or every government conference, people say, oh, you know, we have to instill creativity into young people. Actually, fine, great, of course. But it's the stuff that happens outside school that I would worry about. You know, we want people who are, to put it bluntly, are going to break rules, who are going to completely, you know, who aren't going to listen to their parents and are actually going to chuck out the wisdom of their parents. It's those people that we want. And that's not really something that you cultivate in school necessarily, because it's about saying, you know, a rude word to school. And it's that kind of creativity that I think young people are perhaps losing a bit of. You know, we live in a world where if you take risks, you get punished for that. We live in a world where, you know, if you stand out, it's not necessarily a good thing. I think, you know, our culture has co-opted a lot of the images of kind of rebellious creativity, and, you know, it's there in adverts and so on, but the actual real spirit of it, of revolutionary, radical creativity, I think is slowly being lost. So an even more interesting question for me is, how do we slightly get that back?
Yeah. Especially at a time where everything, or just about everything that you say or do, will be captured and remembered forever. So actually, if you're a young person and you want to experiment with whatever it is, what you're saying, if you are, you know, in a debating society and want to defend a crazy idea, that will come to haunt you 20, 30 years later when you're trying to get a job. So how do we capture that? How do we preserve some of that?
Ooh, a good question. I don't fully know the answer. I do think, as Michael says, curation is important, essential. I do believe we need to re-recognize the role of expertise. That's not to exclude the larger population, no. But I think that, you know, that has to be an essential part of this. Look, we, you know, it's so incredible where we are. I mean, just think about what we're living through. As Michael said, it is unprecedented, but it has to be guided. So for instance, I want people reacting to information, sharing information based on their interests, passion, and their own expertise, not based on commercial viability or
right.
choices. Again, if the platforms are driven by commercial interests, then that's what we'll present, those are the choices people will be presented by, in addition to the loss of privacy. That's not going to do it for us if we want to get together, new communities, and be creative about the real problems that if we don't solve in real time, we're not going to be here for these conferences.
So, but getting to those solutions requires also working with companies that are, as you said, ultimately there for profit, right? But on the flip side also with governments who are saying we need to go with what people also want. So we don't want to overregulate. We don't want to say, well, actually, if people are enjoying this outlet of creativity, we're going to say no, because this is actually not good for you. So how do you make sure that we're not overregulating or over trying to control something that seems to be taking on its own life form, especially as Michael called it, a tidal wave? Solutions here. We need solutions.
Honestly, I'm not sure. I think that the actual danger is over-regulating, and already, let's say, things like the image generating tools are there's a sort of movement building to shut down the new kind of creative models and to say, you know, essentially they are just stealing things and then regurgitating them. And it's an open question which side the legal situation's going to go and then which side the regulatory system's going to go. I would definitely say shutting things down, shutting down new technologies and new tools of creativity never really works in the long run. You can try and say, we're not going to have a printing press in our country, as many countries did try to do. Eventually, everywhere got the printing press and printing became a universal thing. Likewise, you can try and say, right, we're not going to have large language models in America or the European Union because we're worried about copyright and so on, but then China's going to go and do it. And China's just going to leap so far ahead technologically that the US government is going to panic and suddenly they're going to be legal. So governments have to say, all the next generation tools, we are going to let them happen, but in a regulated way. And then we need to teach children how to use them. So going back to that, we need to teach people how to work with these systems. But then just as important, honestly, is when governments need to know when not to interfere. And again, it's a very delicate one, but in terms of this kind of radical creativity, I don't necessarily think that's about governments regulating or not, but it's about creating the spaces in culture that are insulated from profit, that are actually insulated from government, that are truly free spaces. I think, maybe 50 years ago, it was a path for young people in the West to go and kind of do crazy things. I don't think it is anymore. Everyone just wants to go and get a job at McKinsey or somewhere, and that's it. So, how do we create those spaces? I'm sorry, that wasn't a very coherent answer.
Let me just, building on what Michael said, look, regulation that is onerous, banning of books, excluding of information, we're against that. We should all be against that because we need everyone to have that, at their fingertips. We need everybody's intellect, and the technology now makes it possible to bring that together beyond the national scale, at the global scale. But, I think you can't, I think you do need to regulate, for instance, people need to be held responsible for whether the information they're providing is real, is quality, or we will lose our connection to that truth, and we'll be off in some never, never land and never come back from it.
Yeah. So, with that, I also want to talk about copyright and intellectual property, because that's one of the things that people question and say, well, if everything's available to everybody and it can be just, hoovered up, so to speak, by machines, then how do you ensure that you have copyright and intellectual property?
So at the library, we believe creators need to be compensated. There are people who make a living from creativity, and we don't want to cut that off. Copyright needs to ensure that. But if copyright gets in the way of law, as it does now, most of the world's books are locked in copyright, even though no one is reading them. That's crazy. We need to find a way to protect people's copyright interests, creators' copyright interests, but we also can't lose sight of the imperative of setting that information loose and making sure everyone has access to it.
Yeah, actually, I think that's precisely it. And, we're nearly at the end. If there's one message that I would have, it is, I'm a publisher and a writer. I too make my living out of copyright, but I also think it's absolutely broken. It's not fostering creativity. It's not working for the digital age. It's locking too many things away. The actual best challenge for government would be to reform intellectual property and copyright to foster creativity in the new age. That's a huge challenge. No one's worked it out yet. But if a society can do that, then I think that is one of the most profound changes to the sort of creative architecture of the world that could be achievable.
I couldn't agree more. What our mission, our purpose at this point, we are physical. We have to ensure neighborhoods get education and people get after school, all kinds of basic issues. But because we're the biggest library, we believe our mission is every book ever written should be available to anyone on the planet for free through their library. We believe we can find, until governments solve this, a course that enables us to respect intellectual property where it has real value and not use that as a block for enabling everyone to have access to the vast majority of the material, because that's where the key value for society is.
We're out of time, but I have to ask you, but who then pays for it if it's going to be every book ever written is free and available for everybody?
Look,
where's the money coming from?
The things that are commercially viable, that, they'll be libraries or individual purchases. There's no alternative. But most of the corpus of the world's literature, which is not available to most people, isn't commercially valuable, it's intellectually valuable. We can get past this.
Wonderful. Well, what a great note to end on. Thank you for an incredible panel, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.